Abkhazia, a land where empire, identity, and conflict collide, since 1918, it has endured revolutions, repression, and war. Today, we explore over a century of its struggle for recognition and survival. Our story begins in the spring of 1918. Against the backdrop of World War I's end and the Russian Empire's collapse, local leaders in the region of Abkhazia seized a moment of opportunity. On May 13, they declared the independent Democratic Republic of Abkhazia. This bold proclamation united diverse mountain clans, coastal fishermen, and urban merchants under one banner, hoping to secure autonomy in a fractured Caucasus. The newborn republic faced immediate challenges. Scarce resources meant famine threatened many villages. Yet Abkhazians, led by Chairman Pyotr, or the People's Champion, as some called him, rallied volunteers to build schools and clinics, inspired by the promise of self-governance. Meanwhile, tensions simmered with neighboring Georgia, who also had control of the same fertile lands. By late 1919, skirmishes along the Inger River escalated. Georgian forces, wary of a rival Caucasian state, mounted incursions that tested Abkhazia's makeshift militia. Though outmatched, Abkhazians used their intimate knowledge of the steep terrain to repel several attacks, winning a fragile peace agreement in early 1920. As Abkhazia sought recognition, the British briefly occupied Batumi on their way to stabilize the southern Caucasus. While they did not annex territory, their presence granted Abkhazian delegates a platform at regional talks in today's Tbilisi. Despite grand hopes, international support remained elusive. The Allies, exhausted by war in Europe, offered only words of encouragement and no concrete backing. Then came the Red Tide. In February 1921, Bolshevik troops swept through Georgia. For Abkhazia, this represented both peril and promise. The Soviet ideology of national self-determination sounded alluring. Fearing Georgian domination more than Bolshevik rule, many Abkhaz leaders negotiated terms with the Red Army. On March 16, 1921, Soviet forces entered Sukhumi. A new era dawned. Abkhazia was proclaimed a socialist Soviet republic and ostensibly equal partner with Soviet Georgia. The Treaty of Moscow, signed in May, guaranteed Abkhaz autonomy within the USSR framework. In those first months under Soviet rule, literacy campaigns swept through mountain hamlets. Schools taught in Abkhaz and Russian, while newly formed cooperatives organized tea plantations along the coast. Women, long sidelined, found roles as teachers and administrators. For many, the revolution's promise of progress felt real, yet the subtleties of power soon emerged. In December 1922, the Georgian SSR and the Abkhaz SSR joined the Transcaucasian SFSR, a triune republic alongside Armenia and Azerbaijan. Though Abkhazia retained its nominal sovereignty, key decisions, economic planning, security, railway construction, now required approval in Tiflis. During 1923, a cultural renaissance blossomed. Poets wrote in the newly codified Abkhaz alphabet. Theater troupes staged folk dramas, and traditional dances echoed through open-air festivals. But behind the scenes, Moscow's central planners scrutinized every move, channeling funds toward industrial projects that often bypassed Abkhazia's needs. By 1924, the local economy had stabilized. Exports climbed steadily, and Sukhumi's port buzzed with ships bound for Odessa and Batumi. Infrastructure improved. A narrow-gauge railway linked mountain villages to the coast, though in winter it remained impassable. Politically, a cautious equilibrium held. Abkhaz leaders learned to navigate Soviet bureaucracy, pushing for roads and irrigation in return for quotas of grain and timber. The Russian language grew in schools alongside Abkhaz, knitting the republic more tightly into Soviet structures. As we reach 1928, the 10th anniversary of the Democratic Republic's first proclamation, Abkhazia stood at a crossroads. Its mountains had weathered war and ideological upheaval. Its people had tasted self-rule and then adjustment to a powerful new order. The seeds of modern Abkhaz identity had taken root in schools, in songs, and in the rhythms of everyday life. As 1928 dawned, the Soviet Union launched its first five-year plan. Abkhazia's lush hills and subtropical coast were earmarked for socialist modernization. Tea, citrus, and tobacco cooperatives, once budding ventures, now faced aggressive quotas. Small family plots were merged into collective farms. For many mountain villagers, this meant surrendering ancestral orchards and livestock to state-controlled Caucasus. The transition was rocky. Collective machinery arrived late, and local cadres, still inexperienced, struggled to meet grain and timber targets. Yet by winter 1929, collectivization was largely complete. Sukhum's port swelled with crate-loads of tea leaves bound for Odessa, while timber rafts floated down the Inger. Abkhaz workers found themselves integrated into the rhythms of a planned economy. For better or for worse, even as fields were collectivized, Abkhaz intelligentsia nurtured a cultural renaissance. In early 1930, Sukhumi State Theatre staged its first Abkhaz language drama, reviving folk tales once confined to mountain gatherings. New literary journals published poets celebrating the republic's alpine landscapes and Black Sea vistas. But politics shifted beneath these cultural stirrings. In February 1931, the Politburo decreed a reorganization. Abkhazia's status as a Union-level SSR was downgraded. By December, it was folded into the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic as the Abkhaz Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. The change, promulgated nearly overnight, curtailed direct ties with Moscow and placed Abkhaz affairs under Tbilisi's supervision. With new administrative lines drawn, the republic endured harsh campaigns against so-called kulaks. Wealthier farmers, those who had resisted collectivization or owned larger plots, were labeled class enemies. In spring 1932, Abkhaz authorities arrested hundreds, exiling them to Siberia or Kazakhstan. Their homes and fields were redistributed among loyal collective members. Meanwhile, the Koreanization policy, Moscow's early Soviet push to empower non-Russian nationalities, lost momentum. By 1934, Russian became the mandatory language in secondary schools, and many Abkhaz language publications were shuttered. The Abkhaz alphabet, once proudly taught in village classrooms, was now taught alongside and often subordinated to Russian curricula. The mid-1930s brought an even more ominous tide, Stalin's Great Purge. In Abkhazia, local party leaders and intellectuals became targets of denunciations. Between 1936 and 1937, dozens of cultural figures, poets, theater directors, school principals were accused of bourgeois nationalism. Many were arrested, executed, or sentenced to prison camps. Communal fear took root. Families avoided discussing traditional songs or legends, wary that even a harmless folktale could be construed as anti-Soviet sentiment. The rich oral histories of the mountains, passed down through generations, began to fade into whispers. By 1938, Abkhazia stood transformed. Its economy, once a mosaic of smallholders, was fully collectivized and integrated into Georgia's industrial planning. Its culture, formerly a source of pride, had been refashioned under strict ideological guidelines. Politically, local governance answered to Tbilisi, which in turn answered to Moscow's unyielding directives. Yet beneath the layers of repression and control, the Abkhaz spirit endured. In remote highland villages, elders continued to pass down songs and legends in hushed tones. In coastal cafes of Sukhumi, quietly spoken conversations still carried the intonations of the native tongue. And in the hearts of a new generation, born into Soviet structures, there flickered a sense that one day, the echoes of their ancestors might once again rise to the surface. After the terror of the purges, life in Abkhazia carried on under a watchful state. Tea and citrus exports continued, and the narrow-gauge railway connected more villages than ever. In Sukhumi, Soviet propaganda halls screened newsreels celebrating industrial achievement. Yet beneath the surface, villagers whispered of relatives lost in distant camps, and the memory of autonomy felt ever more distant. By late 1940, international clouds were gathering. German victories in Europe set alarm bells ringing in Tbilisi and beyond. In Abkhazia, young men were conscripted into the Red Army, local factories switched to producing wartime equipment. Sukhumi's port prepared to host convoys bound for the Caucasus oil fields. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa shattered the uneasy peace. Though the German advance never reached Abkhaz soil, the Republic felt the shockwaves. Conscription battalions departed for the front, local newspapers printed lists of the fallen alongside heroic Soviet propaganda. Refugees from Ukraine and Belarus arrived by train, bringing stories of occupied towns and scorched earth. Meanwhile, Abkhazia's tea and citrus were deemed strategic crops. Collectives worked day and night to meet quotas. The harvest rushed by lantern light to keep supply lines fed. Women and the elderly staffed the Caucasus, while youth brigades collected pine resin for munitions. Fear and determination fused. Every crate of tea or sack of grain felt like a small victory for survival. As Soviet forces began to push back the Wehrmacht in late 1943, news of victories at Stalingrad and Kursk reached Sukhumi with euphoric relief. Victory parades were modest, led by local militia veterans, but brimming with pride. In early 1944, a contingent of Abkhazian riflemen returned home decorated with medals for valor on the Crimean front, yet celebration was mixed with sorrow. Over 40,000 men from Abkhazia served, more than 12,000 never returned. Memorials sprang up in city squares and village crossroads, inscribed with names that would never be forgotten. The region mourned, even as it rejoiced in the defeat of fascism. With peace restored, Abkhazia faced the monumental task of rebuilding. Farmlands lay fallow from overwork, The railway bridges needed repair. Housing shortages plagued Sukhumis returning families. Under Moscow's fourth five-year plan, reconstruction committees poured resources into infrastructure. The coastal highway was widened, tea processing plants modernized, and new schools erected in highland settlements. However, 1947 brought a fresh wave of repression. Stalin's decree against anti-Soviet elements targeted ethnic minorities across the Caucasus. Although Abkhazia was spared the mass deportations visited upon Chechens and Ingush, suspicion still lingered. Local leaders were scrutinized, some were quietly removed under charges of nationalist deviation. The Koreanization flame flickered once more, and Russian language instruction tightened its hold in schools. By 1948, Abkhazia had emerged from a decade of conflict and constraint. Its manicured tea gardens stood alongside crumbling Caucasus housing. War memorials coexisted with new industrial complexes. The republic was more deeply woven into the Soviet machine than ever before, but in mountain villages, children still learned old songs in Abkhaz, and the echoes of a brief, independent past resonated in quiet moments. As the late 1940s gave way to the 1950s, Abkhazia's coastal highways gleamed with fresh asphalt and rebuilt bridges. Tea factories hummed again, processing leaves for export to Moscow and beyond. Elementary schools reopened in every district, teaching a new generation in both Abkhaz and Russian, yet beneath the progress, subtle tensions lingered. Families still mourned brothers lost in the war. Elders whispered about the abrupt removal of local leaders in 1947, and the memory of looming arrests kept many traditions confined to private gatherings. Still, in village courtyards, storytellers began to teach children old legends, careful to frame them as folklore rather than bourgeois nationalism. In March of 1951, Abkhazia marked the completion of its modern steel-reinforced school in Gagra, a gift from Moscow's reconstruction funds. But the most seismic event loomed outside the republic's borders. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died in Moscow. News spread slowly through Sukhumi streets, vendor stalls lowered their shutters in mourning, and impromptu memorials appeared at railway stations. In the weeks that followed, local officials gathered to reaffirm their loyalty to the Kremlin. Yet many Abkhaz citizens sensed that the demise of Stalin might loosen some of the tighter ideological constraints imposed during the late 1940s. Hopeful whispers spoke of a thaw on the horizon. With Nikita Khrushchev's rise to power, central policies shifted. In 1954, Abkhazia saw the reopening of its Abkhaz language cultural magazine, Apswa, featuring poetry, folktales, and essays. Sukhumi's theater troupe mounted a new production based on the Narts cycle, an ancient epic of the Caucasus, drawing audiences eager for a reconnection with their heritage. Agriculture also felt the thaw. Collective farms were encouraged to experiment with new subtropical crops, kiwis, avocados, and even strawberries. Small experimental plots in Gadada and Akamkaira showcased these trial plantings, promising diversity beyond tea and citrus. Khrushchev's 1956 secret speech denouncing Stalin's abuses reverberated through the Transcaucasus. In Abkhazia, the Supreme Soviet held local sessions where deputies quietly criticized past purges. Some families petitioned to rehabilitate relatives wrongly arrested in the 1930s and 40s. These gestures, while cautious, marked a shift, the possibility of confronting painful chapters of history without fear of reprisal. Local Soviets, people's councils, gained slightly more say in cultural matters. In early 1957, the Sukhumi Council approved funding for a folkloric dance ensemble, which began touring district centers to teach traditional Abkhaz dances, an art form nearly lost during the darkest years of collectivization. By 1958, Abkhazia had carved out a measure of cultural and economic renewal. Its tea gardens produced record harvests, new roadways linked mountain communities, and Abkhaz language films screened in coastal cinemas alongside Russian features. The republic remained administratively within the Georgian SSR, but internally, a renewed pride stirred. In remote villages, elders now spoke openly of pre-Soviet Abkhazia. In city cafes, young writers penned essays on identity and language reform. The republic's generation born during or after the war began to ask questions about heritage, eager to blend their Soviet citizenship with a distinct Abkhaz legacy. As the 1950s came to a close, Abkhazia's subtropical shores shone brighter than ever. In 1959, new sanatoriums opened in Gagra and Patsunda, drawing Soviet holidaymakers seeking sea breezes in therapeutic mineral springs. Trains from Tbilisi and Moscow arrived daily, their passengers greeted by painted signs in Abkhaz and Russian. Cultural life surged alongside its visitor industry. In early 1960, the Sukhumi Philharmonic Hall premiered a concert featuring local composers weaving Abkhaz folk melodies into classical frameworks. Meanwhile, the Apswa magazine published its first color photo spread of the Republican Dance Ensemble, whose performances became a staple of summer festivals along the coast. Education was next in line for renewal. In September 1962, Abkhazia's pedagogical school in Sukhumi elevated to the level of a teacher's institute, offering degrees in Abkhaz language and literature alongside mathematics and natural sciences. Graduates went on to staffing new schools built in Akamkaira and Golripchi districts. Youth organizations, pioneer and Komsomol chapters, became the bedrock of community projects. In 1963, Komsomol brigades completed the planting of over 50,000 citrus saplings across the lowland Caucasus. The project, heavily publicized in local papers, tied patriotic duty to environmental stewardship and promised long-term dividends for cooperative farms. March 1964 marked a turning point. Khrushchev's ouster in Moscow ushered in the Brezhnev-Kosygin era. In Abkhazia, the immediate impact was muted. Reconstruction and cultural programs continued, but the subtle rollback of liberalization began. Late that year, the Ministry of Culture in Tbilisi rescinded approval for a planned Abkhaz language film about the Nart saga, citing ideological imprecision. Yet economic incentives persisted. Under the Fifth Five-Year Plan, 1966 to 1970, the Abkhaz ASSR received increased quotas for tea and subtropical fruit exports. In 1965, experimental avocado groves in Gadada yielded their first commercial harvest, though quantities remained small compared to traditional crops. By 1966, Sukhumi's port underwent modernization, expanding its grain elevator capacity and adding refrigerated storage for tea. A small food processing factory opened on the city outskirts, canning local fruits and bottling citrus juices for distribution across the Georgian SSR. Demographically, the decade saw a gradual influx of ethnic Georgians, engineers, teachers, and party officials drawn by new opportunities. Abkhaz communities felt the shift keenly. In response, local Soviets discreetly prioritized Abkhaz language courses and cultural events to maintain their heritage. By 1968, Abkhazia balanced between two worlds, a growing tourist haven and a tightly controlled Soviet republic. Its beaches thrived with summer revelers, its concert halls echoed with folk-inspired symphonies, and its classrooms brimmed with students learning in both Abkhaz and Russian. Yet, under the surface, the resurgence of Abkhaz identity ran up against centralized authority. As the Brezhnev era cemented its policies, cultural expression would soon face renewed constraints. But for now, in 1968, Abkhazia stood as a land of quiet confidence, its people looking both to the future and to the echoes of their storied past. As 1968 concluded, Abkhazia settled into what Moscow dubbed the era of stagnation. Central planning prioritized heavy industry and stability over rapid change. While Sukhumi sanatoriums continued to welcome holidaymakers, investments in new infrastructure slowed. The promise of expanded rail service to mountain resorts never materialized, and local officials learned to do more with existing resources. Culturally, the Abkhaz Philharmonic maintained its summer concert series, but funding constraints limited touring. The Apswa magazine persisted, though page counts shrank, and Russian-language articles began to outnumber those in Abkhaz. Still, local writers found subtle ways to celebrate mountain lore under Soviet cover stories. In 1971, the Council of Ministers in Tbilisi approved modest upgrades to the coastal highway, the main artery linking Gagra, Pitsunda, and Sukhumi. By summer 1972, widened roadways cut travel times by nearly a third. Small rest stops featuring Abkhaz handicrafts and local tea tasting rooms cropped up, offering tourists a glimpse of native culture. Meanwhile, the port of Sukhumi received new grain silos and an expanded dock for passenger steamers. Though international visitors remained rare, the volume of domestic tourists, Soviet vacationers from across the Union, grew steadily each year. In 1973, Abkhazia's agricultural specialists introduced yield-boosting techniques for tea and citrus, increasing production by 15%. Experimental vineyards planted in the foothills showed promise, with local winemakers crafting small batches of dry table wines, an illicit hobby, since official Soviet policy frowned on commercial winemaking in the region. Demographically, the Abkhaz ASSR saw further population growth as young professionals, engineers, doctors, and teachers migrated from other parts of Georgia. Ethnic Georgians, Armenians, and Russians blended into the urban fabric of Sukhumi, altering the republic's ethnic mix. To preserve their language, community groups organized weekend Abkhaz classes in village houses, taught by retired schoolteachers. By the mid-1970s, a new generation of Abkhaz intellectuals began to quietly question the limits placed on their culture. In 1975, a group of university students formed an informal heritage circle, meeting to document folk songs and legends before they faded, though never officially registered. Their gatherings attracted the attention of local KGB counter-subversion officers, who monitored conversations but tolerated them as harmless nostalgia. Meanwhile, at the Teachers' Institute, lectures on Caucasian history subtly expanded beyond Soviet-approved narratives. Professors reintroduced pre-Soviet maps of the Black Sea coast, encouraging students to view Abkhazia as more than just an autonomous province of Georgia. As Abkhazia approached the 60th anniversary of its 1918 proclamation, planning committees in Sukhumi began organizing commemorative events. A museum exhibition was proposed to showcase early photographs of the Democratic Republic era, and a special issue of Abkhazia was drafted to highlight stories of independence. Yet behind the scenes, officials in Tbilisi debated whether such celebrations risked stoking nationalist sentiment. Ultimately, the anniversary passed with a modest ceremony, a wreath-laying at the mausoleum of early leaders and a concert featuring patriotic Soviet songs interspersed with folk melodies. No speeches mentioned 1918 explicitly. Instead, organizers framed it as part of the broader Transcaucasian Soviet story. As the 1970s closed, Abkhazia's economy felt the pinch of the broader Soviet slowdown. Tea yields flattened despite improved techniques, and citrus orchards suffered from aging irrigation systems. In 1979, the local Caucasus Union petitioned Tbilisi for modernization funds, but resources were scarce, promised upgrades were repeatedly delayed. Socially, young professionals faced limited opportunities. Many engineers and teachers found themselves reassigned deeper into Georgia or elsewhere in the USSR. In Sukhumi cafes, conversations turned from folk tales to the frustrations of daily shortages, milk, sugar, and even reliable public transport. Beneath polite smiles, hints of discontent began to surface. With Yuri Andropov's brief leadership in 1982 and Konstantin Chernenko's in 1984, little changed at the republic level. Yet word spread of murmurings in Moscow about anti-corruption campaigns and efficiency drives. In Abkhazia, factory managers were quietly evaluated on output and honesty. A handful of mid-level bureaucrats were replaced for malfeasance, sending a signal that the center was watching. Culturally, the Abkhaz Writers' Union pressed for greater editorial freedom. In 1984, they published a collection of short stories hinting at anxiety over lost cultural heritage. The censors let it pass, perhaps sensing the winds shifting in the Kremlin. In March 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the CPSU. His twin policies, glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, soon rippled through every Soviet republic. By late 1986, Abkhazia's regional newspaper, Sovetskaya Abkhazia, ran its first investigative piece on infrastructure neglect, openly discussing delayed road repairs and water shortages without editorial cuts. At the same time, cultural organizations seized new freedoms. The Sukhumi Theater staged a play about interwar Abkhaz schoolchildren, a narrative once deemed too nationalistic. Audiences flocked to performances, hungry for stories that spoke of their own past. One of the earliest mass actions of perestroika in Abkhazia arose over environmental concerns. In spring 1987, chemical runoff from a fertilizer plant near Akamkaira began poisoning local wells. Villagers organized unsanctioned protests, blocking roads and demanding plant upgrades. Regional authorities, wary of escalating dissent, negotiated a cleanup plan, marking one of the first successful public petitions in Soviet Georgia. Meanwhile, community reading clubs formed in mountain villages, discussing banned literature, Solzhenitsyn, Pasternak, and local historical studies long suppressed. These informal gatherings laid the groundwork for a new civil society. By 1988, the ferment of glasnost had energized Abkhaz intellectuals to push for greater autonomy. At the October Soviet Council session in Sukhumi, several deputies openly called for restoring the 1921-31 union-level status, a demand unthinkable just years before. Georgian deputies pushed back, warning of divisionist tendencies. Public debates, now aired in local press, grew heated. Letters to editors argued the merits of cultural preservation versus Soviet unity. In coastal cafes, students debated whether Abkhazia should seek direct representation in Moscow rather than through Tbilisi. These discussions, once whispered, became the overt prelude to the ethno-political conflicts that would explode at the end of the decade. Under Gorbachev's glasnost, debates over Abkhazia's status grew louder. In Sukhumi's council chamber, Abkhaz deputies demanded restoration of union-level republic rights, while Georgian delegates insisted on preserving Georgian SSR integrity. By late 1989, mass demonstrations in both Abkhazia and Tbilisi brought rallies, counter-rallies, and the first violent clashes between communities. Rumors of Georgian plans to merge Abkhazia fully into the Georgian SSR stoked Abkhaz fears, and a sense of crisis settled across the republic. In August 1991, the failed coup in Moscow shattered Soviet authority. Georgia declared independence on August 26, 1991, quickly followed by Abkhazia's declaration that it would no longer recognize Georgian laws. The stage was set for armed conflict. By summer 1992, Georgian troops moved to secure Sukhum's approaches. Abkhaz militias, bolstered by volunteers from across the Caucasus and covert Russian support, dug in. The first shelling of villages around the Kodary Gorge sent refugees streaming into the mountains. The siege of Sukhumi dragged on through early 1993. Street-to-street fighting erupted in August, culminating in the city's fall on September 27. A brutal wave of violence forced tens of thousands of ethnic Georgians to flee, many never to return. By winter, a ceasefire brokered by Russia froze the front lines. Russian peacekeepers arrived in May 1994, their presence cementing Abkhazia's de facto separation, while humanitarian convoys struggled to reach displaced civilians on both sides. Peace brought a fragile calm, but economic blockade by Georgian authorities and international non-recognition left Abkhazia isolated. Sukhumi's port lay empty, factories that once canned citrus stood idle. Local leaders formed a provisional government in 1995 and drafted a constitution the following year. With Russian pensions and aid trickling in, schools reopened in autumn 1996, teaching history from an Abkhaz perspective for the first time since the war. Symbolic ceremonies commemorated both fallen fighters and the exodus of refugees, an uneasy reminder of the republic's cost of survival. By 1997, Abkhazian authorities held a referendum affirming their independence, though only a handful of states recognized the vote. Internally, political factions vied for power, the hardliners who sought union with Russia and moderates who favored economic engagement with Georgia under special status. In early 1998, plans emerged for a joint Russian-Abkhaz development fund to rebuild roads and hospitals. Tourism trickled back as Black Sea beaches attracted adventurous vacationers from southern Russia. Yet without broader recognition, Abkhazia remained in limbo, its people determined to govern themselves, even as they longed for security and prosperity. By 1998, President Vladislav Ardzinba had led the young republic through its immediate post-war trials. His government focused on drafting a constitution, ratified in 1999, and establishing ministries for finance, education, and culture. Though few countries recognized Abkhazia, Moscow provided crucial economic subsidies and pension payments, keeping schools open and teachers employed. Sukhumi's once silent port began handling limited Russian cargoes, cement for rebuilding roads and fuel for power stations. In villages like Gadata and Gagra, returning refugees received small plots of land to cultivate vegetables, easing food shortages. Local radio carried programs in Abkhaz and Russian, reinforcing dual identities, fiercely local yet tightly linked to Moscow's lifeline. Entering the new millennium, Abkhaz authorities launched modest economic initiatives. A joint Russian-Abkhaz timber company began sustainably logging cedar forests in the north, while small fisheries cooperatives operated from the Black Sea coast. In 2002, a simplified visa regime with Russia opened the door to tourism. Seasonal guest houses welcomed pensioners and adventure seekers from Krasnodar Krai. Politically, Moscow's influence deepened. In 2001, Russian border guards took up positions along the Inger River, nominally to combat smuggling but effectively securing Abkhazia's frontier. Locals appreciated the stability, even as some worried about creeping dependence. In late 2003, President Ardzinba's health declined, sparking speculation about his successor. The December 2004 presidential election pitted Prime Minister Raul Kajimba against opposition leader Sergei Bagapsh. Allegations of vote rigging led to weeks of tense street demonstrations in Sukhumi, with supporters of both candidates rallying in the central square. Faced with a political deadlock, Kajimba and Bagapsh brokered a compromise in January 2005. Bagapsh would assume the presidency and Kajimba the vice presidency. Sworn in on February 12, 2005, they vowed to balance reform with stability. Their joint administration prioritized rebuilding damaged schools and repairing the coastal highway, key to reviving tourism. Under Bagapsh's leadership, Abkhazia saw renewed investment in infrastructure. In 2006, Russian grants funded the resurfacing of the Sukhum-Gagra highway and repairs to the hydroelectric plant on the Bzyb River. That same year, the government introduced Abkhazia's own passport, required for travel to Russia and vital for claiming pensions. Culturally, the decade brought a revival of public festivals. The day of the founding of the Republic, celebrated every May 13th, featured folk concerts in Sukhumi's Central Park and exhibitions of traditional crafts. Schools gradually reintroduced Abkhaz history modules, teaching students about the 1918 Republic alongside Soviet-era narratives. Tensions with Georgia, long frozen since 1994, reignited in August 2008. When conflict broke out between Russia and Georgia over South Ossetia, Abkhaz forces seized the moment to secure the Kotori Gorge, the last pocket of Georgian control. Russian air and ground forces assisted, and by mid-August, Abkhaz authorities declared the entire territory under their administration. On August 26, 2008, Russia formally recognized Abkhazia's independence, followed in days by Venezuela, Nicaragua, and a handful of other states. The move shattered Georgia's blockade, opening the floodgates for increased Russian investment. Moscow pledged to modernize Abkhaz ports and promised citizenship and direct budgetary support to the republic's residents. In the wake of the August 2008 conflict, Abkhazia leaned heavily on Russian assistance. By early 2009, Moscow had provided reconstruction grants for Sukhum's damaged apartment blocks and the coastal highway. Schools reopened under emergency repair programs, and Russian pension payments resumed in local banks, lifelines for families still reeling from war. Seasonal tourism began to creep back as Russian holidaymakers felt secure visiting the Black Sea resorts. The republic's first post-war president, Sergei Bagapsh, passed away unexpectedly in May 2011. His vice president, Alexander Ankvab, assumed the presidency but quickly faced criticism over perceived corruption and slow progress on infrastructure projects. By August 2011, mass street protests in Sukhumi, Abkhazia's largest since the early 1990s, demanded Ankvab's resignation. He fled to his native Gudara, and the parliament installed Raul Kajimba, returning him to the presidency in October 2011. Under Kajimba, negotiations with Moscow intensified. In September 2014, negotiations ongoing through 2013, the two sides signed the Alliance and Strategic Partnership Treaty, committing Abkhazia to integrate its military, customs, and energy systems with Russia's. Critics warned it risked turning the republic into a Russian province. Supporters hailed it as the only guarantee of security and development. Economically, Russian businesses invested in a new gas pipeline connecting the North Caucasus down to Sukhumi, reducing dependence on coal-fired power plants. The renovated Sukhumi-Babushara highway opened in 2013, slashing travel time between the capital and the mountain lake resorts. As political and economic integration deepened, Abkhazian civil society explored its cultural roots. In 2014, the Ministry of Culture launched a Revive Apsua program, funding folklore ensembles, publishing collections of oral histories, and supporting youth camps in the highlands. At the same time, debates over language policy grew heated. Proposals to mandate Russian in official documents met resistance from elders who saw the Abkhaz tongue slipping from daily use. Local universities introduced a new Abkhaz studies department in 2015, combining history, anthropology, and language courses. An academic push to cement indigenous perspectives in scholarship. By 2016, tourism was again a pillar of the economy. The renovated sanatoriums in Gagra reported record occupancy, almost exclusively from southern Russian cities. Ghost houses in mountain villages offered hiking and heritage tours, while diving clubs explored the submerged relics off the Sukhumi coast. The government also reached out to the Abkhaz diaspora communities in Turkey and the Middle East, inviting entrepreneurs to invest in small-scale agriculture and guesthouse businesses. Microgrants launched in 2017 helped locals establish citrus orchards and beekeeping cooperatives, aiming to diversify beyond tea and timber. By 2018, Abkhazia had stabilized economically and politically, but its international status remained contested. Only 5 UN member states recognized its independence, and the Georgian blockade persisted at every major crossing. Yet internally, the republic had rebuilt homes, modernized key infrastructure, and rekindled cultural life. New faces in government, many educated in Russia, brought fresh energy, even as they navigated the delicate balance between autonomy and dependency. After a decade of reconstruction, Abkhazia entered 2018 with relative stability. Raul Kajimba's administration continued to court Russian investment, while civil society groups pressed for greater use of the Abkhaz language in schools and media. In October 2020, as Kajimba's second term ended, Aslan Bazania, a former security chief with a reputation for pragmatism, won the presidency in a tightly contested vote. Bazania took office in December 2020 amid rising concerns over corruption and economic stagnation. His first months focused on pledges to improve healthcare, restore crumbling infrastructure, and reduce dependence on Moscow subsidies, goals soon overtaken by global events. Just weeks into President Bazania's term, the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the Caucasus. In March 2020, Abkhazia closed its only official crossing on the Inger River and suspended flights from Russia. Hospitals in Sukhumi, long under-resourced, struggled to cope with the surge of patients. With Russian medical teams and vaccine shipments arriving in late 2020, mass immunization began, but vaccine hesitancy and logistical gaps slowed the campaign. Lockdowns forced sanatoriums and guesthouses to shut their doors for the first time in decades, plunging many families into hardship. Still, local volunteers set up food deliveries for elderly islanders in Gagra and Akamkaira, and online language classes kept Abkhaz studies alive among displaced students. By mid-2021, as case numbers subsided, borders tentatively reopened to fully vaccinated visitors, signaling a cautious return to normalcy. With tourism trickling back, the Byzania administration launched Abkhaz Spring, a suite of microloans aimed at small farmers and guesthouse owners. Citrus growers in Godota used these funds to modernize packing facilities, while mountain homestays advertised heritage tours to adventurous Russian travelers. On the political front, local elections in 2021 saw a new crop of deputies, many women and youth activists, enter the Sukhumi Assembly. Their priorities: anti-corruption measures, expanded Abkhaz language media, and improved waste management along the coast. The shift was subtle but notable, a generation raised post-war now asserting its voice in governance. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Abkhazia again found itself at a geopolitical crossroads. Moscow began distributing Russian passports en masse, offering citizenship already de facto in many cases to bolster local loyalty. By year's end, over half of Abkhazia's population held dual status, a move decried by Tbilisi as unlawful annexation in all but name. Economic ties with Russia deepened accordingly, direct flights from Sochi resumed, and regional airlines added routes. Remittances from Abkhaz nationals working in southern Russia increased, cushioning the impact of Western sanctions on Moscow. Yet concerns grew over demographic shifts, as some Russian retirees bought second homes along the Black Sea, changing the character of coastal communities. 2023 to 2025, navigating uncertainty and the quest for recognition. In late 2023, President Byzania reaffirmed his commitment to a balanced foreign policy, seeking limited engagement with Georgia under special status agreements, talks that remain stalled. Locally, civil society organized cultural festivals celebrating Abkhaz music and cuisine, reinforcing identity even as political status lingers in limbo. The COVID rebound gave way to energy challenges in winter 2024, when aging power grids buckled under storms. Moscow dispatched generators and technical teams, demonstrating both support and dependence. Meanwhile, younger Abkhazians, educated abroad on Russian scholarships, returned with startup ideas, ecotourism apps, online language platforms, and heritage craft cooperatives, signaling a gradual shift toward a more diversified economy. As of June 2025, only 5 UN member states recognize Abkhazia's independence. Yet life in Sukhumi thrives in its own rhythm. Cafes bustle with students debating film adaptations of the Nart saga, olive groves hum with bees in spring, and in remote highland villages, elders still share legends of the 1918 Republic under starlit skies.